Windsor Castle's ancient courtyard, a brash tourist sneers at the costume party uniform of the motionless guard. Between jokes about toy soldiers, he doesn't notice the combat medals half hidden beneath scarlet wool, earned in the dust of Helmand Province. Nor does he recognize that the ceremonial rifle contains live rounds. As his mockery bounces off stone walls, he's moments away from discovering why the Queen's Guard are soldiers first, tourist attractions second. His education in respect starts now. Before we dive back into the video, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you're loving this story, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something huge you won't want to miss. Trust me. Now back to the video. The tourist, Richard Caldwell from Chicago, steps closer, waving his hand inches from the guard's face. Cameras click. His own son records, half mortified, half amazed by his father's audacity. "Hello? Anybody home?" Richard taps the guard's chest. "Do they hire you by the mannequin hour?" Sergeant James Harrison's eyes remain forward, jaw clenched beneath his bearskin cap. His finger rests beside the trigger, not on it, never on it, unless necessary. 3 combat tours taught him when to move and when to wait. The crowd watches, breath held collectively as Richard reaches for the guard's bayonet. I wonder if this thing is even real. Richard Caldwell thrived on being the center of attention. Back in Chicago, his booming insurance firm rewarded his brashness with 7-figure bonuses. Now, leading his reluctant family through Windsor Castle, he performed for an audience of strangers rather than clients. "Dad, please," whispered Emma, his 16-year-old daughter, shrinking behind her mother. People are staring. Richard ignored her, positioning his designer sunglasses despite the overcast English sky. His wife, Catherine, exchanged apologetic glances with nearby tourists while their 12-year-old son, Tyler, filmed everything on his phone. "This whole country's stuck in the past," Richard announced loudly, playing dress-up and pretending it's still an empire. Sergeant James Harrison stood at his post, eyes fixed forward, bearing the weight of both tradition and memory. Beneath his bearskin cap, sweat trickled down his neck despite the cool air. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him patience under pressure. 8 years in the Queen's Guard had perfected his stillness. 24 hours earlier, Harrison had received the letter, formal notification that his former platoon mate's appeal for asylum had been denied. Rajiv, their Afghan interpreter, would be sent back despite the Taliban's death sentence awaiting him. Harrison's testimony at the hearing hadn't been enough. A young woman in a trim blazer with a tour guide badge approached. Charlotte Bennett had been guiding Windsor Castle tours for 3 years while completing her military history doctorate. "Sir," she addressed Richard firmly, "if you'd like to continue with the official tour, I must ask you to step back from the guard." "Well, hello there. Someone who actually speaks." Richard turned, momentarily distracted. "Tell me, how do they recruit these mannequins? Drama school dropouts?" Charlotte's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. Sergeant Harrison served with distinction in Helmand Province. 3 tours. He received the Military Cross for valor under fire while rescuing wounded comrades. Richard's fingers brushed against the bayonet's edge. "Probably plastic, like everything else about this. Stand back from the Queen's Guard." Harrison's voice exploded through the courtyard like artillery fire. In one fluid motion, he pivoted, rifle swinging to port arms position, boot heels cracking against cobblestones. Richard stumbled backward, nearly falling. His sunglasses clattered to the ground. The courtyard went silent except for the echo of Harrison's command reverberating off ancient walls. Jesus Christ. Richard's face flushed crimson. He could have taken my eye out. Harrison stood at attention, eyes locked forward again, but his position had changed, now directly between Richard and the entryway to the inner ward. The message was clear. "You shall not pass." Tyler whispered, "Holy crap," still filming everything. Emma inched behind her mother. An elderly man with a military bearing watched with approval, arms folded across his chest. Charlotte stepped forward. "Sir, touching the guards or their weapons is strictly prohibited. It's clearly stated in the visitor guidelines." "He assaulted me." Richard pointed accusingly at Harrison. "He performed his duty," Charlotte replied evenly. "The Queen's Guard are authorized to respond to direct interference. They're not decorations, Mr. Caldwell. They're elite soldiers with live ammunition." Richard's eyes narrowed. "How do you know my name?" Your son's been using it rather frequently while begging you to stop, Charlotte said, nodding toward Tyler, who looked away, embarrassed. A uniformed castle security officer approached, radio in hand. Is there a problem here? Before Charlotte could respond, Richard thrust himself forward. Yes, this so-called soldier just assaulted me. I want him disciplined immediately. The security officer, a former Metropolitan Police Sergeant named Donovan, assessed the situation with practiced eyes. Sir, I'll need you and your family to come with me. Excellent. Finally someone taking this seriously, Richard said, straightening his collar. Donovan's expression remained neutral. The incident requires documentation, sir. Your tour group will continue without you. What? No, that's ridiculous. It's either that, or we can involve the Thames Valley Police, Donovan said quietly. Your choice. Catherine touched her husband's arm. Richard, please, let's just go with him. Richard glanced around, suddenly aware that every phone in the vicinity was pointed at him. This wasn't the audience he'd wanted. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Fine, he snapped, then jabbed a finger toward Harrison. But I want his name and badge number or whatever you people have. Sergeant James Harrison, sir, Charlotte said before Donovan could respond. Military Cross recipient, distinguished service. Record. Perhaps you'd like to see his citation while you're filing your complaint. The crowd had begun to murmur, some openly hostile toward Richard. The elderly military man stepped closer to Charlotte, his voice pitched for her ears alone. That lad Harrison, he's the one who lost his team in the Helmand ambush, isn't he? Charlotte nodded imperceptibly. And his brother at Bastion. As the Caldwells were escorted away, Tyler turned back, still recording. Through his phone screen, he saw Harrison resume his motionless vigil, but something had changed. The guard's eyes now tracked his father with the focus of a predator sizing up its prey. This is outrageous. Richard paced the small security office. Do you know who I am? I'm on the board of the Chicago Insurance Coalition. I golf with senators. Donovan typed impassively on his keyboard. Please state your version of events, sir. Catherine sat with Emma and Tyler on a bench against the wall. Emma scrolled through her phone, deliberately ignoring her father. Tyler reviewed his footage, pausing occasionally on Harrison's face. My version. That toy soldier assaulted me. Richard slammed his hand on Donovan's desk. I want to speak to someone in charge. The door opened. The elderly military man entered, followed by a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit. Mr. Caldwell, I'm Jeffrey Winters, Castle Administrator. Colonel Hayes has informed me of the situation. Finally, Richard stepped forward. Your employee attacked me unprovoked. I've reviewed the security footage. Winters interrupted, coolly. And several visitors have already uploaded their videos to social media. And Windsor Guard is trending. Tyler looked up. It's got over 50,000 views already, Dad. Richard's face paled slightly. Look, this is all a misunderstanding, is it? Winters placed a tablet on the desk, showing Richard's mocking performance from multiple angles. Because it seems quite clear you violated explicit rules about interacting with the Queen's Guard. I barely touched him, and he... Sergeant Harrison, Winters continued, is one of our most decorated soldiers. The Queen herself presented his military cross. Richard faltered, then rallied. Well, I'm still filing a complaint. As is your right. Winters nodded to Donovan, who produced a form. However, we're also required to file our report with the Ministry of Defense. Interfering with a guard on duty is a prosecutable offense. Catherine stood. Prosecutable. Richard, that's enough. Apologize so we can go. Apologize? For what? Being a paying visitor? Richard scoffed, but his bravado was cracking. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. Young man, do you know what Sergeant Harrison did to earn his medal? Richard crossed his arms defensively. Enlighten me. He carried 3 wounded comrades through enemy fire after their vehicle hit an IED, then returned under sniper. Fire to recover their interpreter. Hayes' eyes bored into Richard's. The same interpreter your government is now sending back to certain death. What's that got to do with me? Tyler suddenly spoke up. Dad, you should see this. He held up his phone, showing a viral compilation already, forming online. Entitled American Gets Schooled by Royal Guard. Richard's confident facade crumbled as he watched his face, contorted with mockery, replayed for the world to see. 3 hours later, the Caldwells retreated to their hotel suite, Richard's humiliation now complete. The hotel staff whispered as they passed through the lobby. A British tabloid had already published a front-page headline, "Yanked, disrespectful American taught lesson by Queen's Guard." 6 million views and climbing, Tyler announced, staring at his phone. "You're more famous than that disaster girl meme." Richard poured himself a scotch, hand trembling slightly. "It'll blow over." "Blow over?" Catherine's voice was ice. "Your face is on BBC News. Your little performance is the top trend worldwide." Emma looked up from her laptop. "Dad, your company's been tagged thousands of times. People are calling for boycotts." Richard's phone began vibrating incessantly, message notifications pouring in. He picked it up, face draining of color as he scrolled. "My partners are calling an emergency board meeting." A knock at the door made them all jump. Catherine opened it to find Charlotte Bennett standing in the hallway. "Miss Bennett?" Catherine frowned. "How did you find us?" "I need to speak with your husband," Charlotte said, expression grave. "It's urgent." Richard approached warily. "Come to gloat?" "Hardly." Charlotte entered, closing the door behind her. "You've created a situation far beyond a viral video, Mr. Caldwell." "What's that supposed to mean?" Charlotte pulled out her phone. "This just aired on Al Jazeera." She played a clip. Richard's mockery of Harrison's uniform juxtaposed with footage of Taliban fighters celebrating. Arabic subtitles scrolled beneath. "I don't understand," Richard said, genuinely confused. "They're using your disrespect of a decorated Afghanistan veteran as propaganda," Charlotte explained, voice tight, "claiming Western powers don't even respect their own soldiers who fought there." Tyler sat forward. "What does that have to do with us?" Charlotte met Richard's eyes directly. "Sergeant Harrison's Afghan interpreter, the man he saved in Helmand, is being deported tomorrow. The Taliban has now specifically named him in a new video, citing this incident as proof that Western promises of protection are worthless." Richard blanched. "That's absurd. I had nothing to do with Rajiv Kumar saved 23 British lives as an interpreter," Charlotte cut in. "Including Harrison's. Noah's execution video will likely include footage of you mocking the uniform of the man who tried to save him." The room fell silent. Catherine covered her mouth. Emma looked at her father with fresh disgust. "There has to be something." Richard trailed off. "Actually, there is." Charlotte leaned forward. "Harrison's commanding officer is hosting a private reception tonight for MPs, advocating for interpreter asylum cases. Veterans will speak about their experiences." Shep paused, "Including Sergeant Harrison." "What's that got to do with me?" Richard asked, but his voice lacked its earlier arrogance. "The Home Secretary will be there. A public apology from you, the viral American tourist, expressing support for the interpreters could change the narrative. Possibly even Rajiv's case." "Absolutely not." Richard paced the hotel suite. "This isn't my fight." Catherine stood with arms crossed. "Richard, a man's life is at stake." "How is that my responsibility?" He ran his hands through his hair. "I made some jokes about a ridiculous hat. I didn't create Taliban propaganda." Tyler looked up from his laptop. "Dad, your name's trending with our Save Rajiv now. People are connecting the dots." "People see what they want to see," Richard muttered, but his conviction was wavering. Charlotte placed a photo on the coffee table, a grinning young man in dusty fatigues beside Harrison, both giving thumbs up in front of a Humvee. "That's Rajiv. He has a wife and 2 daughters. They're in hiding now." Emma picked up the photo. "He looks so young." 24 when this was taken, Charlotte said. "Same age Harrison's brother was when he died at Camp Bastion." She met Richard's eyes. "Harrison lost his brother and his entire squad. Rajiv is all he has left from that tour." Richard turned away, staring out the window at London's skyline. For the first time since the incident, his face showed genuine conflict rather than just wounded pride. "I'm sorry about this interpreter, but I'm not going to humiliate myself further." His voice lacked conviction. "My company's already threatening to remove me as CEO. That's already happening regardless, Catherine said quietly, holding up her phone. CNN's running the story. Your partners have released a statement, reviewing your position. Richard collapsed onto the sofa, head in hands. This is insane. 24 hours ago, I was respected. Successful. Were you? Emma's question hung in the air. A sharp knock at the door silenced them. Tyler opened it to find Colonel Hayes standing there, ramrod straight in full-dress uniform, medals gleaming. Mr. Caldwell. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I've just come from the detention center where they're holding Rajiv Kumar. Richard looked up. Why are you telling me this? Because Sergeant Harrison is there too. Hayes's voice was measured but tight with emotion. He's been there all night, trying to stop the deportation. I still don't see. Harrison saved that young man's life at extraordinary risk to his own. Hayes interrupted. Now he's watching him being sent to certain death because of bureaucratic nonsense. That's not my fault. No, but your mockery is being used as the final nail in Rajiv's coffin. Hayes placed an envelope on the table. This is an invitation to tonight's reception. The Home Secretary has the authority to grant emergency asylum. Richard hesitated. What would I even say? You'd need to make a full public apology. Express remorse. Support the interpreter's cause. Charlotte leaned forward. It won't undo the viral video, but it might save Rajiv. Tyler put down his phone. Dad, I've been editing the footage I took. There's something you should see. He played a clip, Harrison's face in close-up during Richard's mockery. The camera had caught something nobody present had noticed. A single tear tracking down the guard's stoic face. He was crying. Richard whispered. That was right after he'd received the deportation letter, Charlotte explained softly. His commanding officer said he'd never seen Harrison cry. Not when his squad was killed, not when his brother died. Richard stood abruptly, walking to the window. The suite fell silent. What time is this reception? He finally asked, voice barely audible. 7 o'clock, Hayes replied. At the Wellington Barracks, Harrison's battalion headquarters. Catherine approached her husband, placing a hand on his shoulder. Richard, for once in your life, this isn't about you. Richard's phone buzzed again, another email from his board. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. His career was in free fall. If I do this, will I have to face Harrison? His voice trembled slightly. Charlotte and Hayes exchanged glances. Yes, Charlotte said. He'll be there. Richard closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, he felt the unfamiliar sting of shame. Real shame, not just embarrassment. I'll need a statement prepared, he said quietly. Something that might actually help. Emma stood. I'll help you write it, Dad. Tyler nodded. I'll edit more footage. Show what really happened. Wellington Barracks loomed imposing in the evening. Light. A line of black cars deposited politicians and military officers at the entrance. Richard tugged at his borrowed tie, glancing at his reflection in the car window. I look like I'm heading to my own execution, he muttered. It's just an apology, Richard, Catherine said, smoothing his jacket. You've negotiated billion-dollar deals. Those were easy. He swallowed hard. I was selling something I believed in myself. Colonel Hayes approached their car. Mr. Caldwell, the Home Secretary has arrived. If we're going to do this, it needs to be now. Richard took a deep breath, clutching the speech Emma had helped him craft. Will he accept my apology? Hayes's face remained impassive. Sergeant Harrison is a better man than most. But what you need to understand is that this isn't about you and him anymore. He gestured toward the building. In there is a room full of men and women who've seen things most civilians can't imagine. They're fighting to save the people who saved them, and they all know who I am. Yes. Hayes didn't sugarcoat it. The infamous American tourist. Richard squared his shoulders. Let's go. The reception hall fell silent as Richard entered. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway toe-lips. Every eye in the room, decorated generals, politicians, in bespoke suits, veterans with visible scars, turned to stare at the American tourist whose mockery had gone viral. And there, standing rigidly by a window, was Sergeant Harrison. Out of uniform, he looked both smaller and larger, more human in his civilian clothes, yet somehow more imposing without the ceremonial trappings. Their eyes met across the room. Harrison's gaze revealed nothing. Colonel Hayes guided Richard toward a silver-haired woman in the center of the room. "Home Secretary, may I present Mr. Richard Caldwell?" She extended a cool hand. "The American gentleman from the video. Your timing is impeccable. We were just discussing Rajiv Kumar's case." Richard's prepared speech suddenly felt inadequate. "Madam, Secretary, I—" A commotion at the door interrupted him. A military aide rushed in, whispering urgently to Harrison's commanding officer. The room tensed as the officer's face darkened. "They've moved up Kumar's deportation," he announced. "Flight leaves in 90 minutes. Harrison's posture stiffened. Though his face remained composed, his hands clenched into fists. The Home Secretary sighed. "There's nothing to be done at this hour. The paperwork—" "Excuse me?" Richard's voice cut through the murmurs. Every head turned toward him again. His prepared speech lay forgotten in his pocket. "I don't know much about international relations or military service," he began, voice wavering slightly. "Until yesterday I thought those guards at Windsor Castle were just tourist attractions in funny hats." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "I was wrong." Richard swallowed hard. "I didn't see the medals. I didn't see the man behind the uniform. And I certainly didn't see how my disrespect could be weaponized by the very people our countries fought against." He turned directly to Harrison. "Sergeant, I mocked your uniform without understanding what it represented. I didn't know about Rajiv Kumar. I didn't know about your brother or your squad. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but I am profoundly, deeply sorry." Harrison's expression remained unreadable. Richard turned back to the Home Secretary. "Madam, I'm told you have the authority to stop this deportation. I'm just a tourist who made a terrible mistake, but my video has been seen by millions. If you save Rajiv Kumar, I'll make a new video. I'll tell the world that Britain stands by those who served alongside her troops." The room held its breath. The Home Secretary studied Richard's face. "And if I don't? Then I'll still make the video. I'll stand outside 10 Downing Street every day until someone listens." Richard's voice steadied. "My company's board is meeting right now to fire me. I have nothing but time." A ghost of a smile touched the Home Secretary's lips. "Colonel Hayes, get me a secure line to the detention center." She looked at Richard. "It seems our American friend has found his courage." Across the room, Sergeant Harrison gave Richard a single, almost imperceptible nod. 3 days later, Richard stood in the same Windsor Castle courtyard where it all began. This time, no crowd gathered. The morning mist hung low over the ancient stones, and the tourism hours hadn't yet begun. Beside him, Tyler adjusted his camera. "Ready, Dad?" Richard nodded, clearing his throat. "Ready. Rolling in 3, 2, 1. "My name is Richard Caldwell," he began, looking directly into the lens. "You may recognize me as the American who mocked a Queen's Guard at this spot last week. What I did was inexcusable. What I've learned since then has changed me forever." The video would eventually reach 20 million views, more than double his moment of mockery. It would feature Rajiv Kumar's story, now safely granted asylum with his family. It would explain how interpreters risked everything to help coalition forces. And it would end with Richard's simple plea: respect the uniform, but more importantly, respect the person wearing it. As Tyler finished recording, a figure approached from the castle, Sergeant Harrison, once again in full ceremonial uniform. "Sergeant," Richard said, extending his hand, "thank you for meeting us." Harrison shook it firmly. "Mr. Caldwell." An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Harrison spoke. "Rajiv asked me to thank you. I'm just glad he's safe." "He is." Harrison's posture relaxed slightly. "He starts work next week, actually. Translation services for the Ministry of Defense." Richard smiled. "That's excellent news." Harrison glanced at Tyler's camera. "Will your video mention that your company's board reinstated you?" "With conditions," Richard chuckled. "A year's salary, to veterans' charities, and mandatory sensitivity training." The morning silence wrapped around them again, but it was different now, respectful rather than tense. "I should return to duty," Harrison said finally. Richard nodded. Of course. As Harrison resumed his post by the castle entrance, he did something unexpected. A subtle nod of acknowledgement as Richard and Tyler departed. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something more valuable. Respect, hardly earned and freely given.